My name is Michelle. I help organize this event, and I'm glad that you guys can make it here on this rainy day. Um, Feel free to get snacks and drinks at the back of the room. We'll have dinner served after the Q&A, which is going to be poke. There's vegan, gluten-free options, all that sort of stuff. If you get a chance, make sure to scan this QR code for Radius, which is the sponsoring organization for tonight. And with that, I will give a sort of brief introduction to tonight's event, which is called This Utopia Does Not Exist. All right, so we're here at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is a private land-grant university situated on Wampanoag and Massachusetts land. In this square mile, from the 1940s onward, physicists, engineers, and cybernetic researchers developed technologies like radar, feedback control systems, and digital computers, simultaneously influencing a utopian mythology around how new technologies could liberate society and consciousness in the aftermath of World War II. Throughout the 20th century, the Bay Area countercultural figures and Silicon Valley business evangelists braided this digital utopian mythology into free market ideologies to create a tech world driven by venture capital hype toward chronic disruption that we see today. Reality strikes back as we see institutions weakening, failure to regulate technologies, and confusion about who really gets to govern the future of our society. As it turns out, this utopia does not exist. Today's speaker, Mike Pepi, is a tech worker, critic, and writer based in New York. As an art critic for over a decade, Mike has been published widely in venues including Art Forum, Frieze Magazine, Rhizome, eFlux, and Spike Magazine. As a tech worker by day, Mike turns his critical eye toward the utopian promises of the tech world in his book Against Platforms, Surviving Digital Utopia, published by Melville House in January. So we're excited to have Mike join us here to discuss what it means to survive digital utopia, the difference between platforms and institutions, what they even are, and the urgency of focusing our efforts as designers, artists, and engineers in the room today toward building a new digital era for institutions. Thank you to MIT Radius and the Office for Religious, Spiritual, and Ethical Life for supporting this event. Radius, which is formerly known as the Technology and Culture Forum, was founded in the 1960s by Episcopal chaplain Mike Bloy, an MIT scientist returning from the Manhattan Project. This event kicks off Radius's programming for the year, facilitating a space for critical discussion about technology and its social context. Following Mike's presentation, we hope you'll stay for the dinner reception, and if you wish, grab a copy of Against Platforms generously, or offered by the MIT Press bookstore, we are grateful to have at the corner of the room here. So with all that, please welcome Mike Pepi.
Thank you. Thank you. So thanks so much for that introduction, Michelle, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Nicholas and everyone at MIT and MIT Radius for hosting me today. It's really a privilege to get to expand on some of these ideas with this group. So I'm looking forward to it. Okay. So this project really began with the ideology of digital utopianism, the belief that the progressive innovations in technology and technology alone will create a more egalitarian, democratic society. This ideology is responsible for some of the most pivotal economic and political developments in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. The rise of personal computing, mobile devices, social networks, and the low interest rate fueled venture investments formed what some scholars have called platform capitalism. Other than the physical technology and infrastructures that make this all work, what accounts for the rapid rise of this new power center? Surely the power of Silicon Valley is not simply a feat of superior engineering. So my fundamental argument is that what makes digital utopianism today so much different than other kinds of utopianisms, or even other ideologies in general, is its singular disregard for our existing political, social, and cultural institutions. This rather abstract development is referenced constantly under the rubric of so-called disruption. Disruption generally refers to Clayton Christensen's coining of the term disruptive innovation, and that targeted large incumbent corporations. I'm more talking about the kind of Silicon Valley utopian who wants to remove our most essential institutional structures. In their place, this digital utopian prefers digital platforms. And this is what makes today's digital utopianism so elusive. It's a worldview where political institutions lose their basic connection to the public. My argument is that the route towards combating this ideology can't just be to reform or amend its aims or its actions, but to fundamentally reconstitute the role that institutions and institution buildings play in our digital economy. So as you all know, we're not starting from scratch in this criticism. In the last decade plus, we've seen a backlash to the exploitative power of digital platforms. This includes a critical literature dissecting its effects, a new type of journalism holding these platforms to account, and a popular revolt against these new forms of control. We know today that the dream of the digital utopians was a mirage. The cyberspace where corporations and states have no stronghold was a fiction, and the digital networks that we have erected instead enable them historically unprecedented levels of command and control. The platform owners told us they were tearing down gatekeepers, but instead chose profit. My work meets this critical reaction midway. Still, I find something that is missing. How and why did our institutions of small L liberalism fail to contain such a consolidation of power? If today's predicament is any measure, the checks on this power badly need reform. In the 2010s, we saw the dark side of private sector disruption. But in the 2020s and most recently in this election, we're seeing what happens when Silicon Valley platforms gain the kind of power once reserved for the state. Too often, what we call technology criticism resorts to lazy dystopia. The future problems are both more mundane in their causes and the ways that they will be carried out. Plus, you will not get very far trying to persuade a utopian that they are building dystopia. As we know from Thomas More, utopia is nowhere to be found. It's the same for dystopia. It's an illusion that critics would be foolish to follow. The focus of our criticism then should be on the root ideology and its connection to power. If you persuade people why a specific ideology takes hold and what the stakes are for its proliferation, you will have done much more than simply attacking a specific local formation. So I like to imagine the mythical metaphor of the Hydra and being in battle with the Hydra as Hercules is here. If you just cut off one limb, you will still have to deal with the others. Killing off Theranos, exposing charlatans like WeWork founder Adam Neumann, and investigating the fraud underlying FTX won't stop these kinds of things from popping up again. Some of the greatest achievements of the techlash of the 2010s have done little to slow down new forms of the same. How many techno-utopias have to fail before we learn to apply some scrutiny? Instead, I ask that we focus on the neck that connects the many limbs to the head, the site of the ideology. So how can we distill Silicon Valley's ideology down to its core elements? How do we separate the apparatus of technology from this broader worldview? The outline for this book started as a list I published on my website. I called it the Elements of Technology Criticism. It was my attempt to synthesize this new field into a set of recurring general principles. It was a diagnostic of the folly of Silicon Valley's hubris after it had been laid bare. But it was also a forward-looking taxonomic guide to the ideology of platform capitalism's most essential contradictions. One of the core tenets of the elements was to make visible what had always been purposely obscured, to bust the myths that were increasingly accepted as conventional wisdom. But what made it most potent, I think, was the way it was a blueprint for political action. I hope that those who build things with technology would be able to recognize these contradictions and that would be able to understand how they've led us to our current ideological impasse. When an ideology becomes so overpowering, the first act of resistance is to simply name its components, to make them visible, and this starts the work of unseating its silent power. So I'll walk through the 14 elements for you today to give you a bit of a grounding. The first one, data is never raw, immanent, or neutral. There is always bias and distortion in capture and modeling. The internet is not a thing. It is a distributed network of many layers. Treating it as its own monolith with a central cultural logic presents problems. Technology can never occupy a space outside of capitalism. With the most rare exception, every application, company, or innovation has a funding source, will have a board, and will have a bottom line. And in all cases, the logic of capitalism will eventually supersede and control technical tools. Too often, what we identify as technology is just capitalism, just faster and worse. You can't solve a social problem with a technical solution. Applying technical fixes only treats the symptom, and in failing to address the underlying cause of the problem makes it worse. If you are not paying for a platform, your data is the product. Attention is data, and data is a commodity. If something is free and connected to a network, beware of the trade-offs. Decentralization is an illusion. Even distributed networks enforce hierarchies of power and influence. Software is hard. Computing interfaces, rules, interactions, and protocols encode certain behaviors, and for that, they should be scrutinized and interrogated as part of the body politic and the built environment. Algorithms are made of people. They are editors. They steer and privilege certain values and are never objective. Beware of open access. Information may want to be free, but somewhere a new gatekeeper will benefit. Once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a measure, or Goodhart's law revisited. Optimizing for a goal in a closed system will reinforce the production of that goal, and it will cease to deliver any insights. Information is the enemy of narrative. The more information you have, the more doubtful narrative becomes. Crowdsourcing is a race to the bottom. Labor, knowledge, education are all cheapened when forced to compete on a platform. Making it easier to perform a task on a platform has massive externalities. And this is the big one. Your brain is not a computer, and your computer is not a brain. There are things that cannot be automated and intelligences that machines cannot have. And lastly, moving on to the rest of the talk, platforms are not institutions. You confuse them at your own risk. Now, we will get to institutions later, but first I want to talk a little bit about how we arrived at the contemporary form of digital utopianism and why that has so much to do with the digital platform. So how did we get here? I'd like to offer two big points about today's digital utopianism and its platform formations. One, platforms and digital utopia are not native to technology, nor even computing or digital media. All of those things exist alongside it, but are not totally contained by digital utopianism. For example, there's hardware, software, and even AI tools that don't spring forth nor recreate the world in the image of the digital utopianism. Second, today's digital utopian has morphed into a kind of self-fulfilling prophet whose chief target is not necessarily the absence of technical progress, but instead the form of the institution itself. As Elon Musk's now almost totally mothballed DC-based skunkworks project Doge has shown, the goal is less efficiency than it was the destruction of any institutional political boundaries that created constraints against the scaling powers of computation, and specifically AI. So if we agree that for now technology and Silicon Valley are connected yet distinct formations, here's my very simple, abbreviated intellectual patchwork diagram of somehow how we arrived at our Silicon Valley of 2025. The Silicon Valley of Doge, the Silicon Valley that's allied with Trump's MAGA movement. Let's start with the beginnings of the computation, what I call the right-wing foundations of compute. Charles Babbage's difference engine was formulated on theories of labor discipline. This was a reflection of Babbage's belief that the highest ambition of the plantation or factory manager was to reduce the skill and cognitive ability or cognitive complexity of a worker's tasks. From its earliest days, computing's intent has been to shrink the human involvement in the administration of multifaceted instructions. So we're already off to a pretty rough start. A few generations later, the father of cybernetics came to a different conclusion. Norbert Wiener, alum, warned about the dangers of automation and advocated for the democratic control of the rising power of cybernetics. James Barbrook details in his wonderful book, Imaginary Futures, how Wiener's left-wing cybernetics would be defeated by John von Neumann's right-wing vision of cybernetics, one that was perfectly aligned with the Cold War imperatives of the time. Wiener's idea that cybernetic feedback could improve human institutions was replaced by von Neumann's capitalist interpretation. If computers could become thinking machines, then artificial intelligence research could eventually replace humans and labor. Naturally, corporations were interested. It wasn't long until the hippies joined the party. The Whole Earth catalog, published by Stuart Brand, inspired a loose grouping of new communalists who formed a technocentric revolution against the authoritarian Cold War state. Information wants to be free was their rallying cry. But free from what? Free from institutions, which, in their view, was the root of all societal friction and corruption. Enter the libertarians. This came to head with John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. Cyberspace does not lie within your borders, he harangued early attempts at governance of the nascent internet. Do not think you can build it as though it were a public construction project. Barlow is clear. The government or any institution should steer clear of our new cybernetic home of the mind. But whose minds exactly was this home to? The answer for Barlow, unsurprisingly, was libertarians who distrusted any type of regulatory checks. Now, permit me one more quote from Barlow's 1996 declaration. We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere, may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. How soon would we realize that the online world is but a hyper-extended mirror of all of our existing biases and censors, and that humans behind the servers monitor and manipulate messages on a grand scale? How soon would we discover that access to computation would not be evenly distributed, but in fact would exacerbate the divide between the media rich and the media poor? Then we meet the so-called sovereign individuals. This is the name of William Rees Moggs and James Dale Davidson's bestseller from 1996. They promised a future where the, quote, the individual will become more of an entrepreneur, a private contractor in complete control of his finances, with easy access to enormous computing power. Technology would enable self-starters to reorganize power according to the logic of the private market. No pesky public bodies would meddle in the supreme logic of the digital will. But to get to the real heart of the platform ideology, read The Cathedral and the Bazaar, Eric Raymond's manifesto on building open source software. For Raymond, projects should be distributed bazaars of activity, not cold, planned cathedrals. Cathedrals are, quote, carefully crafted by individual wizards or small bands of mages working in isolation. This slow, deliberate work is no match for the networked and digitally enabled bazaar, where many software developers move fast by releasing early and often, delegating everything they can, and being open to the point of promiscuity. This veritable Bible for computer engineers soon jumped out of the network and into the governance of the physical world, where most human organizations came to be seen as much maligned cathedrals. Finally, we have the efficient exit of the entrepreneur. The management method known as the lean startup is a lightweight program of data-driven optimizations designed to scale startups. The model prizes efficiency, often ruthlessly so, via what they call a test and learn approach, to rapidly experiment until an optimal solution is reached. Lean startups aren't just lean in their small size and quick movements. They are part of a related shift from institutional administration to quicker sensing corporate bodies. This philosophy has been applied more broadly in a related move away from democratic governance to a kind of technocratic, neoliberal rule of positivist calculation. In lean society, political institutions need not stand in the way of good data. Then there is the Silicon Valley Exit Group. This started with Balaji Srinivasan, the founder of the network state movement. It started out as a fringe idea, but today, so-called seasteaders have grown into a hyper-libertarian movement among startup founders to exit from the state, where decentralized entrepreneurs can work in international waters, unencumbered by institutions of government and law. Finally, there's Peter Thiel, who I think needs little introduction on this matter. Nearly everything he's done in his career has been set towards using the power of computation to weaken institutions. Not just specifically academic institutions, He is the founder of the Teal Fellowship, which offers students $100,000 to skip college to focus on being entrepreneurs, but also social institutions. He was recently asked by a New York Times columnist whether he wanted the human race to endure, and he had to pause before he could answer. While all of these thinkers share the standard fare of digital utopianism, each in their respective era, technology, or political background, what I think is left out of the analysis is that what I think unites them all is the way that they use the platform as leverage against public institutions. So now we come to the most difficult question. How do we define institution? The term has basically been a floating signifier, both in my use and elsewhere, and it's notoriously hard to define. But the rise of platforms has thrown the essential characteristics of what we once called institutions into sharp relief. In the age of platforms, an institution can be understood as a complex and enduring organizational form distinct from the agile and often extractive nature of digital platforms. Institutions are a series of habits or practices, sometimes organized into a cohesive unit, sometimes not, that carry out the production of objects, political goods, or services. Institutions enact a mission, a conviction, or belief in spite of external influences that might compromise it. Institutionalists comes most into focus when we witness them persist in spite of a prevailing wisdom or opinion, not because they're unpopular or anti-democratic, but because they stand for something. That something, an idea, a good, a norm, is reasonably fixed for the purpose of the constituents of the institution itself. Before I go further, I always have to give this word of caution, this disclaimer. I'm not here to lionize our institutions of the past. It is in fact their failures to deliver on their missions, their failure to adapt to the present, and their succumbing to the worst forces of elite capture, which has led to their demise. The institution is a symbol of so many previous abusive edifices, and its name almost arrives as a pejorative every single time. To institutionalize something is to sap the life from it. We shouldn't design our new institutions with this fixed power as their primary virtue. Institutional critique, critical theory that began decolonizing institutions, all were correct. The problem was that their solutions were no match for the digital age. One other simple way to define the institutional form is by looking at what they produce in contrast to the platform form. Here are some examples of institutions broadly conceived and their platform replacements. In each of these cases, the platform seeks not to deliver the material of the ecosystem, but to colonize the transactional space to extract value. The prime example of this I find in Spotify. In 2017, Spotify began using fake AI-generated music under their own label to deliver music without paying for it. These so-called ghost artists have been uncovered thanks in part to Liz Pelly's investigations. Spotify has refused to label the work as AI-generated. They simply don't care that the music isn't made by bands. They only care if you are listening. Platforms replace institutions where the value is most intangible, is most unquantifiable. Organizations that have missions tuned to something larger than themselves are the greatest foil for platforms. These goods and services of the institution cannot be replaced by the platform because not everything is a race to insert compute. And we are finding that out now. In essence, the best institutions act as membranes. This is a term I echo from the artist Jack Ridker. These membranes define what is let in, what is let out, and the energy produced. They are the keeper of the distinction between production and consumption, a distinction that the platform collapses. Institutions embody this collective agreement and the fabric of meaning that above any external forces builds as opposed to extracts from cultural and social value. In the age of platforms, the challenge today is to reconfigure and revive institutions, employing what I call intra-institutional technology. that augments their missions without cannibalizing them, ensuring they remain resilient and essential brokers of human experience against the backdrop of ubiquitous computation and AI slop. Here's a rough speculative timeline for our new project. Recall the platform era. I date it roughly 2010 to 2020. These were the boom times for free culture, zero interest rates, subsidized cheap stuff, and rented experiences. And this was a large-scale transfer of previously undigitized value into networks, and eventually centralized platforms. This surfeit of information paved the way culturally and technically for the AI era. Catapulted out of the AI winter by the advent of user-friendly and functional, coherent, generative adversarial networks around 2014, the focus of Silicon Valley's intellectual and financial propaganda shifted rapidly. Artificial intelligence, which itself is a floating signifier for predictive and generative models of the world, and at worst, a marketing term for machine learning, now shifted into the territory of cultural and social institutions. Why? Well, that is where the utopian most likes to play. Every cycle of disruption, Silicon Valley must intervene and capture the social and cultural narrative from non-digital meaning-making frameworks. It must reproduce this meaning through its proprietary software as a service model. And it must do this all the while optimizing for the outcomes of the managers of the platform and its owners. But what platformists and techno-determinists misunderstand is that driving automation costs to zero, and thus automating most economic tasks, will only reaffirm the importance of the role of human institutions in constituting what is consumed and served. By making economic concerns obsolete, this will remove the market's authority in judging what is worth producing and consuming. The trick then is to resituate institutional membranes in this new arrangement, where digital tools might liberate creativity, but not to the unilateral gain of large for-profit platforms incentivized only to grow. While it may feel like we are on a one-way track towards platform dystopia, be aware of the opposing flow. With the platform era coming to a close, partially due to AI slop's overreach, and AI driving cognitive costs to zero, counterintuitively, institutional structures will enter a new growth phase in response to a new demand for shared narrative. Once we've retreated from the chaos of platform transactions, there will be a new premium put on human provenance, authenticity, and non-transactional connections. AI slop fizzles out into its own endless machine loop. Institutions take on a new essential brokering function. What were once weaknesses in the platform era become strengths. But what will these institutions look like and how they will sustain within digital frameworks is a question of political design. Less relevant is what tools are actually in place, provided they are not operated by the incentives of the platform. With institutions, material support for production is separated from its consumption. On platforms, all of those need to be operating on the same rails to enable the totalizing optimization for the growth of the platform itself. On Substack, you are both paying for journalism and doing it at the same time. You are both the audience, producer, and you're cutting out the middleman. When you discover music on Spotify, you are not so much discovering music as you are discovering Spotify, and in turn, feeding the platform information they use to grow more optimally. This is because for both Spotify and Substack, they are not measuring music or journalism, the institution, but measuring and growing their value from containing a monopoly on the buyers and sellers of what was formerly a loosely entangled ecosystem. This is fundamentally different from the aim of journalism. Music and journalism are just the pretext. This disaggregated ecosystem of delivery and their central motivating ideal are simply the raw material for the platform. Converting any shred of economic value or human joy into a two-sided marketplace, tying it up to protocols that are manipulated and optimized, is the dream of the venture capitalist investor, not the engineer. The engineer can build and improve institutions without lapsing into this platform form, but they need organizational guardrails, and they need a model. I propose we take a look at the sailboat as the institutional MVP or the institutional model. Institutions possess a committed physical organizational form, which can be diverse, but fundamentally synchronous. This encasement allows for the embodiment of an idea, mission, or responsibility for the production of a set of values. The boat floats and moves, yet nonetheless has a committed structure and design. Institutions are composed of clearly defined groups of people who have a fixed relationship and roles within the institution. This clarity of role and incentives, unlike the often ambiguous relationships found on platforms. On platforms, the operators are constantly pitted against one another in a war of all against all that is liable to optimization or change in order to benefit the growth of the platform itself. And institutions operators tend to have structural bottlenecks to guard against the suddenly changing roles of constituents in ways that violate the organization's larger purpose. In this example, the boat has human operators that are bound in a structural commitment to sail. Institutions are driven by specific intent and a metaphysical idea of a productive goal or mission. This mission enacts a conviction or belief in spite of external influences and dictates what should be produced and what is intrinsically worth consuming, rather than merely providing the infrastructure for its consumption. Unlike platforms, which are content agnostic and prioritize transmission, institutions have a point of view on things in the world. The boat's intent is to sail. And finally, the existence in an external field. Institutions are not utopian, suspended monolithic spaces. They operate within an external field, facing demands and requiring compromises. They can even be sustained businesses that deal with markets, and they can take and hold power in ways that do not need to seem exploitative. Yet crucially, they hold a greater responsibility to a public, and always a mission. While they are subject to market logic, they are not superseded by it. In this example, the boat must adapt to winds and currents. In contrast, this model of the institution is the form of the platform, which I use the visual metaphor of the Medusa raft. There's no defined direction. There's panicked, anxious users fighting for scraps. There's no committed encasement. It's temporary, flexible, and cheap. And it's completely at the whim of an external market and field. So I'll end with something a bit more tactical that contrasts the institution and the platform. And this is really for anyone wondering whether what they're building is being designed as a platform or an institution, or something else along the spectrum. First, institutions have good clock speeds. Douglas Rushkoff uses the analogy of the innate relationship between figure and ground. In a marketplace, the figure are the objects for sale. The money, on the other hand, is merely the ground, literally the supportive infrastructural medium, the tool. And this enables the flow of goods. It is the goods that are the central figure in the institution of the marketplace. He then speaks of the problem of figure-ground inversion, a process by which a market becomes so financialized, like 21st century high-speed financial trading or digital platforms, where the ground ceases to simply be the infrastructural tool and instead rises to become the central aim of the organism. In this inversion process, money becomes the primary figure of the market, and objects become merely the ground. This is all to say that good institutions have a good figure-ground relationship to time. Time is their ground, and the intent and the missions are the figure. When a platform creates asynchronous exchanges, when many actors can work anytime without any kind of ordering or hierarchy, it achieves this at the expense of a shared narrative about the purpose of the exchange and the activity. Next, institutions are positive-sum producers. Platforms are zero-sum extractors. They constitute the raw material of the platforms. Institutions are extracted from, not extractive themselves. They organize themselves this way because they have a responsibility to something other than growth. Institutions have intent. They realize a mission. They have a point of view of things in the world. Platforms care only about transfer. They snuck this in through the side door of benevolent centralization. As a result, platforms are deeply wary to try to paint a picture of what should be set on their rails. An institution, on the contrary, should have an explicit future picture of what it will create. Every organization is influenced by the way it acquires and distributes resources to operate. Platforms accumulate the value of an investment. An institution's funding sustains the enactment of the stated mission. The financial backing of an institution should come as close as possible to supporting its central mission, and not simply the growth of the infrastructure. Finally, the institutions are federalized and reproductive, but not monopolistic. While platforms' optimal focus is on exchange, they are designed to enact monopolistic control over these exchanges. Their designs do not account for competing platforms. The scale of software must realize its single purpose by bearing the infrastructure to anything in its path. Platforms don't really believe in what they're making so much as they believe that they must be the means of mediation. It follows that their only goal then is to mediate more things, no matter what they are. Institutions, on the other hand, are fine with competitors. That's just one more member in their community of shared narrative. In the next several years, we'll be confronted with the disruptive collapse of existing institutions of various stripes. Though this time, the destruction will be directly and purposefully enacted by agents of platforms installing AI and other extractive technologies into the administration of public life. Our answer to this assault cannot just be to make a new or different, improved platform. We must reconfigure institutions for this age of ubiquitous computation. All of this exists on a spectrum. For example, these new institutions don't need to be afraid of indulging in techno-determinism. They cannot, like traditional institutions, ignore the technological change around them. This new type of organization must emerge, one that employs intra-institutional technologies. The strongest of the democratic and/or intellectual qualities of institutions can still exist in their fullest expressions while being encased in and elasticated by software. The ideology underneath and within these new institutions should be a kind of enlightened techno-progressivism, defined as the idea that digital tools can augment the missions of institutions without cannibalizing them whole from the outside. Intra-institutional technology is a call to build technology that is not a solution to the problem of the humanist democratic institution. It dispenses with the utopian visions of a cyberspace without political bodies, and does not aim to replace their functions with computation, as if that would make our problem simply disappear. Intra-institutional technology is hard. It does not take the techno-fix shortcuts. It has to design not just for the potential expressions of the underlying technology, but for political and social constituents. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, for making a diagnosis of this timely issue and beginning to point us in a direction towards a positive vision where we can begin to build as engineers, artists, and designers in this room here today. So we'll follow up with a sort of a Q&A, and then after that, we'll have dinner together. Also wanted to make a small nitpick. Professor Norbert Wiener, he was a professor here. And so around the 1940s, for anyone who came in, I gave a little bit of history. If you walk around in this building here, in this institution, there were so many things that were precursors to the digital utopianism that building the mythology around the digital utopianism that we see in Silicon Valley today. So I just wanted to point that out as well again.
So he wasn't an alumni, he was just a professor?
He was a professor here.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and also the father of cybernetics,
yeah.
as mentioned. So I wanted to start us off with a question. So one big social media or platform that we, pretty much all of us, have contact with is social media, which have taken a significant role in disseminating information of all kinds to people and superseding traditional news outlets, mass media, journalism altogether. So it seems like a central concern for a whole lot of years about this shift is the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation. So you'll see a lot of concern about this, a lot of commentary about like, what are we doing about the misinformation and disinformation? So I wanted to ask, what was your take on those social media platform attempts to kind of curb and intervene in this issue? You'll see things like community notes, you'll see things like banners beneath your YouTube videos about like climate change. That try to direct people towards an institutional body. So what do you say, is that something that works, or what are these platforms trying to do?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating question. I think right now it's not working right now based on my most recent look at the situation. Right. I think of the first example of in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination. You had on X and Grok AI. It had essentially two conflicting stories in real time. Right. I think as we move from AI essentially trying to become the truth seeker or the journalistic entity, I think what you're going to start to see is this sort of model collapse where people will purposely try to poison the model to create its version of truth, right? So in the case where you have platforms using AI to fact check things, that's going to go down a road that gets very scary quickly as you have essentially malevolent actors trying to influence it. And you have pretty openly people like Elon Musk saying that they're trying to de-woke the AI, right? So right there, you already get this turn away from this idea of an imperfect institution of journalism towards this idea that there is an objective AI truth that is sifting through information rapidly to debunk it. I largely have seen that the initial commitment to fact-checking, I'm thinking of Meta, of course, started out as a very benevolent idea. But I think it was probably a year ago now where when push came to shove, I think Meta they slashed that team, or they tried to automate it or replace it with AI. So I really don't think there's a future there for that. And I think that places like institutional brokers that try this, like think tanks, actual journalistic outputs, organizations that don't necessarily care about speed or being first, they care about getting it right, they care about the investigation, are starting to show the cracks as well, because they're forced to compete against this instant AI platform, people saying, Grok, is this true? And there's really no way for them to get out of that feedback loop. So I actually am pretty concerned about that particular manifestation of that attempt to try to use fact-checking and crowdsourced intelligence to get at what previously was done by the institution, again, imperfect, of journalism.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And with that, I'll open up the questions to the audience, and then after that, you just pass it around, please. All right, I'll start here.
Hi. I apologize. I got delayed and came here kind of late, so please forgive me if you covered this in your talk. But so I do research into online community spaces, and the conclusion that I've come to so far in my research is that you need a new way of structuring the platform. And one way to structure a platform is in a completely transparent, auditable, reproducible way, which allows you to actually provide an insurance policy to the users in the form of complete data dumps of the platform, allowing you not only for the code of the platform to be open source, but the community itself, including the data. So if the platform itself goes rogue, such as happened with X, the users can actually fork the entire platform or portions of it. And I was wondering, I'm looking for collaborators. I was wondering if you've heard of anyone else doing similar research or coming to similar conclusions or building anything similar to this.
I think I've heard a lot of people come to that conclusion. I largely think essentially it's the idea that if you can open source and create transparency into the machinations of a platform, that is essentially an institutional check on various abuses and issues. I've heard, I think that's a valid idea. My problem is what does that look like in practice? It seems difficult to create that. What you say reminds me of another sort of discussion I have in this larger question is, at what point do we sort of institutionalize platforms, or at what point do we start calling platforms themselves institutions? At what point what can we do to their architecture that can, like I say, kind of create a hybrid where you have these checks and balances, all the things I talked about, but you also have essentially manifested them in what looks and feels like a platform to the end user. So I think that's what you're talking about. I've sort of seen a few different attempts at this. There's a group called Other Internet that does this. in terms of thinking about taking cultural institutions and various research groups and kind of pulling them together and uniting them. And I think there's a way to do it where it depends less so on the technical protocols and more so on the sort of underlying funding structures, right? You'd have to have a sort of structure where certainly taking something like venture capital is out of the question, right? And certainly thinking about revenue streams starts to get very difficult, right? So I think really the root problem is like, do we just have to go back to some sort of public funding to keep the full stack from being manipulated or removed, right? My super lefty, very almost like throwback ideas that how do we go back to this to public funding? How do we go back to state funding? Is there a way where we can combine these two things? Because I feel like anything in the private sector just very quickly goes down that road where, right, like the algorithm will essentially.
Hypermonetization.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of what I would like to address is providing like an insurance policy for either just taking the platform down or hypermonetization or any other like number of scenarios that have happened with existing platforms. But yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying. Like VC funding would be.
But I mean, this is essentially what a DAO is, right? I mean, in a way, right? It's this idea that there is. I feel like a lot of the people in the crypto community have tried this, but I haven't really seen that many success stories, although I'm interested to learn about more.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, Mike, thanks for the great and optimistic talk, which you don't get a lot these days, so I appreciate that. I've just got a very simple question. You've got the goal zone up there. What are some nascent institutions being built in that goal zone area right now that come to mind for you? I mean, I can think of a few maybe. I'm just curious if you have any. Are there any is there anything emerging?
You said I was optimistic, but I don't have any.
Well, you had when you showed the institutions of your sort creeping back in. The premium on human provenance. That's optimistic to me. No, but I'm just curious if there's any kind of emerging models of this type of institutionalism that you.
Yeah, the one that I think of would be Other Internet, which is what I just mentioned. They strike me as a place that is aggregating it's sort of like a federalist model where they aggregate multiple institutions, not in like a sort of platform or feed way. And they're essentially able to kind of like congregate in this sort of digital mutual kind of association. That's one that I like. And part of why I say like this is the goal zone is to try to get people away from thinking we have to go back to the institutions of the 20th century, right? Like we can't really do that. Not to say I wouldn't. we should try, but it's like that's gonna be hard. So what I'm trying to do is get people to go somewhere where you're looking at the affordances of networks and software, but you're not sort of like following it to its sort of like utopian logical conclusion. I mean, I'm a member of several different Discord communities that I think of a lot with this. What I love about those is that you have it does feel like the user is in control in some sense, but you do essentially get to get the network effects of a group of like-minded or not people kind of working together. The question is, how do you go from the Discord, into IRL, or how do you go from Discord into something that essentially sustains itself, right? You don't necessarily have to like leap off of these tools in order to become become an institution, because I think that's sort of what we're starting to realize is we are now realizing that we're defaulting back to the word that some of you are probably familiar with. This is sort of dark forest theory, right? I think we're seeing a move back to the dark forest theory because of this reaction to the platform. So I think the sort of dark forest theory, which I obviously didn't get into and didn't really want to like expound upon, but it does come up in your question. I do think that that's probably a pretty fertile bed for some of this stuff.
Cool. Thank you.
Sorry, did you say dark forest or dark force?
Dark forest.
Oh, okay.
The dark forest is
Yeah.
silicon. No.
Usually applies to space. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting.
That would be an interesting name for a.
Thank you for the great insights. So I am a kind of a storyteller who's producing content in a small scale in a private platform. And yeah, so this is one thing that customers keep saying, yeah, we can get all this for free in YouTube and Spotify. Why would we pay you? So I think it's more like at this point become like a David versus Goliath problem. And is there anything that's now going to be the next step in this direction? I mean, I understand the problem. I am a direct, not beneficiary or anti-beneficiary of the problem. So what is then the next possible logical steps for us as, as a society for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the example you brought up, the idea of, I mean, YouTube has so many different applications that it's going to disrupt. But I think of specifically Sam Altman the other day said that they need to build a bunch of new data centers because he said if we do this, we can do one of two things, or we can do both. We can cure cancer with AI, or we can provide free education to everyone on Earth, right, with AI. Whether or not you believe that that's possible or something that could happen, what I find so interesting about that is we agree with the end goal of doing that, of course, but do we necessarily agree with the method of delivery, right? I mean, does that mean that we don't have any kind of educational institutions anymore, right? Does that mean that there are no schools as such? I think that's probably what he's saying. Or does it mean that this AI power gets integrated into some sort of encasement, like a school? So what I think the next step is how do we take this technology and tell a story about the value of something like an institution of education or a school, right? Like what I find in the discourse now is these things feel like they're so pitted against each other and mutually exclusive, and I would like there to be a way that we could tell a story about why should we persist in some of our humanist institutions while adapting new technology. Because what I fear is actually the techno-utopian position is that we should just completely remove all of those things and it should all be run on sort of like one chassis. And that I think is a big problem. So I think that would be the next step. Thanks for your question.
My question is about the issue of accessibility, because I feel like I was looking at your list of platforms versus institutions, and I feel like in that sort of boom of the platform of the 2010s, platforms were sold to us as more accessible than institutions. It's easier to go on Spotify than it is to go to a CD store and listen to, So I think we sort of took that for granted in the 2010s that access was a good thing. And I still believe that to an extent, but I also wonder what that sort of, how that factors into your goal zone. Like how do we make institutions both accessible and also separate from this sort of capitalist techno determinism?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I see this a lot, right? I see when I think of virtual reality. This comes up a lot with virtual reality, right? I think it provides the impetus for innovation because something like VR could, of course, open up a world of opportunity to people with any kind of access issues. And while that's correct, I think the problem is it's actually quite almost nefarious how they sort of use that as an excuse, right? They sort of use that to protect them from any other type of criticism or any other type of criticism. And no, by the way, the headset is $1,000, right? So accessibility, I find, as you pointed out, it was a Trojan horse in a way, I think. Not to say that it does not actually increase access. And I also agree that institutions largely, the reason there was this demand was because, and we're using access in the broadest terms, right? But there were gatekeepers. There were accessibility issues with all types of institutions and media. What I think is the first point is to say, call the bluff on some of Silicon Valley's stories they tell about that. But then also, I would say, this is why I say that the goal zone here should be a synthesis of this, right? If there is a way to take the accessibility of digital networks and digital media and sort of encase them in this institution. I think what that's not essentially the story you're being spun from Silicon Valley about their new VR headset, right?
I have a question about the role of internet technologies specifically in government. I think at the beginning you had a picture from Nepal, I think. Was that true? Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you want to talk about that. And I'm also curious if you ever came across things about how Estonia uses like blockchain technology, and if you can say anything about that.
Well, first on Estonia, yeah, a few years ago they were the first digital nation, right? They did this whole process. I thought that was interesting. I actually would like to revisit that. I don't know where that falls on this, but I do feel like they led with the idea of the state, right? They led with the idea that some sovereignty that is pre-digital grounded that essential encasement, right? So that was super interesting. But yeah, I mean, the situation with Nepal was also interesting there. I mean, essentially, for people that don't know, my gloss over this, what happened there was they essentially overthrew the government. The reports out of there were that it was largely Gen Z, whatever that means, and that they elected a new leader on Discord. I thought that was an appropriate metaphor for the collapse of an institution and its replacement by what is essentially a social network. And back to my other point about Discord, like I think it's no surprise that Discord was how they organized that, right? And the issue is, right, like what's next, right? Like what's the day after you elect a new prime minister on Discord? Like what does that look like? I wish them luck, but I just find that I thought that image was kind of an appropriate metaphor for where we are now.
Well, thank you.